This topic, mobility in cities, I think is one of the most interesting ones that we touch on at Hello Tomorrow, because it really gets at the heart of so many technologies and how they come together, but also so much of what human life is. You know, with more and more people moving into cities, and cities having passed the 50% of human population now living in cities, that mark a few years ago, the decisions we make now about cities, how they're formed, their technologies and things like that will be with us for not just decades, but hundreds or even thousands of years. So I wanted to start out just by way of introduction of having both Chloe and Anita talk a little bit about their companies. Unfortunately, we're not talking about cities on Mars yet, but if you could just tell us a little bit about your work, and yeah, that would be a great way to start out.
Hello? Do you hear me? Yes.
Yeah.
So I'm Chloé. I'm working for La Fabrique de la Cité. La Fabrique de la Cité is a think tank. We are in Paris, and we are working on urban innovation. We are not coming from the field of the deep tech, but we are thinking about urban innovation and what will be the consequences of urban innovation on the future of the city. So we are working not only on the topic of mobility, but we are working also on the topic of, for example, energy, urban planning, new technology, and new users. Yeah.
Okay, great. Anita?
Hello, the name of my company is Airspace Experience Technologies, and we are an aerospace technology company and a startup located in the United States in Detroit, Michigan, and we're working on the development of a new type of aircraft, specifically an electric vertical takeoff and landing aircraft for urban air mobility applications. So it's a new space in the market where we can actually use air taxis as a means of transporting people within urban centers and between urban and suburban locations, and also move cargo in that way.
Okay, so to start out, let's talk a little bit about this intersection between mobility, technology, and cities, you know, how they're formed. So Chloe, we were talking about how the roads, the layout of cities, and everything about, you know, how we design and live in them has been influenced by the mobility of the day, and vice versa. How cities are built influences what technologies work there. And now it seems like all at once we've got 300 years of change. We've got not just, you know, autonomous vehicles and flying cars. We've got hyperloops. We've got electric scooters. We've got bikes. We've got a million things going on at once. So how do you see that playing out in the work that you do, and Anita too? What, you know, how do you see your technology fitting in with this plethora of new inventions?
I think it's a good thing that we have a lot of solutions today to move in the city, because if we are thinking about what is mobility, mobility is not just to transport people from A to B. Mm-hmm. Mobility is a combination between transport, of course, mm-hmm. and different ways to transport people, also mm-hmm. by foot. And you have also the question of the activities, your daily life activities, why you have to move, because it's an important question. And then you have the other question, it is localization, because it will depend how you move in the city from where you are living, where you are working, and what kind of family do you have, if you have any family or not, if you have to make a long distance trip or a short distance trip. So if you have just one solution, you do not have the solution for everybody. Mm-hmm. So to have a more inclusive mobility, you need a lot of solution to make it possible. So I think it's a very, very exciting period to think about it. But of course, if you have a lot of solutions, you have also to think about coherence mm-hmm. between the different solutions. And mm-hmm. that's a big challenge of today.
Yeah, okay. Anita, how about you? You've got a kind of a radical plan for getting around?
So I think what everyone can agree to if they live in an urban environment is that congestion is at an all-time high, and it's not getting any better, and it requires a new solution too. So you actually have to disrupt the entire concept of what is mobility in an urban-suburban environment. And so the way that we're approaching that is that instead of thinking about commuting in 2 dimensions, we're thinking about commuting in 3 dimensions. So right now, if you're on roads, that's 2 dimensions. If you can put yourself in the air, all of a sudden you can create a whole new 3-dimensional one-dimensional view of solving the congestion problem. But the way that we're tackling it specifically is that it can't all be people driving in individual cars. Europe does a much better job of using mass transportation, US not so much. And so these have to be shared rides. These have to be vehicles which have a reduced carbon footprint by using batteries as a means of thinking about a different way of getting around in a ride share capacity, but also not by yourself, but with other people.
Mm-hmm. So you're proposing flying cars. We've seen cities struggle with Uber, much less autonomous cars or flying cars. Like, what hope do we have that anybody is going to be making good decisions about these technologies?
Who can make the decision? Of course, you have a lot of new challengers in the cities that are coming to introduce new technology, but mobility is also the interaction between a technology and an infrastructure. And who is responsible for the infrastructure? This is what cities are. So we have to think about who makes a decision. We see with Uber that it's very difficult for a company just to come and to propose a solution and not to think where I am, what is the transportation system, what is the vision of the mobility of the city. Because if you are making so, maybe you will have clients, but at any time, the city will say, no, it's not possible. We have seen that, for example, in London, where Uber could not work anymore. So they should negotiate with the city. And that's a pretty difficult thing because, of course, when we are talking about Uber or other solutions, they are global. And cities are not global. Right. And you have city governments that are local, so you have to find ways to negotiate with each city and to find a way to find how this solution can be coherent with the whole system's vision of mobility. And then you can be really successful, I think.
I actually was at a mobility conference in Denver a few weeks ago, and there's a lady who put together a book. Her last name is Sadiq Khan, and she ran the sort of the MTA system, I think, in New York for several years, and she showed this amazing graphic of 60 people in cars, 60 people in ride-hailing service, and 60 people on bicycles, and how much footprint that took. Obviously, the ride-hailing service, car ride-hailing service, and the cars was the same thing, right? So we have to think about ways to get people into shared vehicles. And so mass transportation is the key. There's many different ways to address mass transportation. Part of it is going to be trains, part of it's going to be hyperloops, part of it can be flying cars with people sharing them, but it's about shared mobility solutions that also incorporate bicycles and walking to be able to reduce that. So that requires the government to come in from a planning perspective to think about it, but there's many different pieces that have to come together from a technology side to really solve that congestion problem. And autonomy, actually, I think is going to be the key to that.
So the robots will save us after all. That's good.
Perhaps.
Yeah. Well, so to take a really specific example, I was reading this morning, so Uber has, as you guys might know, has invested in a bike system called Jump. There are also these scooters, and they're now investing in that. And they're basically taking all this data about where people are riding, and I should have also mentioned autonomous vehicles and flying vehicles are also areas that they're investing in. So Uber's kind of like the Monsanto sometimes of mobility. It's the company everybody loves to hate at the same time that we enjoy using the products and services most of the time. So they've got the investments in this whole stack from flying cars, autonomous cars, down to scooters. And they're collecting this data and using it to basically know a lot about who we are as people, where we're going, what we're doing, and ostensibly to make it a better service for us, to optimize, if you get dropped off here, you can pick up the train or things like that. But what do you think about this, this organization having so much information about individuals?
I mean, I think that privacy is a big concern, and I think you do need to have the government come in from a regulatory perspective to make sure that data isn't being taken from you without your permission. But I've also heard the other side of it, which is that if the government is collecting this data, it can use things to create a traffic management solution, use things to create off-peak and on-peak and smooth everything out. So I think there's a way that data can be used, but it should be freely available to all companies. It shouldn't be just going to one company. So maybe that's one way to solve it.
Yeah, of course, the question of privacy is central. It's central because also because of social acceptance. Because if you know that you have all the data from, that Google have all the data about you, it could be really a big challenge, and maybe you can have a high difficulty to use these services, and you are looking for alternatives. But I think also it's also a technology challenge, because you have to make something with this mass of data. You have to collect this data. You have to have this data in data center, and we have to face the challenge of climate change. So it's another challenge, privacy and technology, how to store this mass of data. But I think also it's also a question of public space, because we are always talking about the people, about the privacy of data of people that are using those services. But what we are seeing with autonomous vehicles is that also, when you are not using those services, for example, the autonomous vehicle is collecting data about you when you are just walking in the city. Also, if you do not have a smartphone, also if you are not connected. And this is a real problem. And we see, for example, this privacy problem in Toronto with the new neighborhood of Google, where the citizens are saying, okay, I'm just a citizen, maybe Google wants to build a new city. Okay, it's fine, but may I go there if I am not accepting that just as a simple citizen, I do not want that Google is collecting data without that I need the services. And I think it's a more bigger challenge, how we can protect the privacy of normal citizens in public space, and what does it mean for public space.
Yeah. So I have to admit, that was actually a trick question, because it was the city of Los Angeles that's doing this. It wasn't Uber. Does that change the equation for you at all? If the city, can just decide this data is ours and you'll be reporting it if you want to have a permit to operate in the city, and they collect all this, no warrants, no reason for, looking into anybody's behavior, but they just get to? Is that fair?
Maybe it could change something if the city is collecting the data and not Google, but it's not changing the fact about this topic, what is public space. And public space, Walter Benjamin, it's a sociologist of the late 19th, early 20th century, is saying that the city is the place of the freedom because of the public space, because you can be anonymous there. And anonymous means anonymous, so no data about you. It's just that you meet other citizen and you are anonymous, so you can live just without to be knowing. And if the city knows everything about you, or Google knows everything about you, it's always the topic, somebody knows everything about you.
Yeah.
I also think it depends on how the data is used, right? So data is collected all the time. I mean, we go in airports and we get on planes, and so and there's calculations that cities make for all kinds of planning. So it's already used. If it's used for the greater good, if it's used to optimize travel efficiencies, if it's used to decide how many vehicles do I need between 9 and 12 versus in the evening, that's fine. If it's misused in a way to, how am I going to get you to this restaurant, this person prefers veggie burgers versus, I don't know, tacos. If it's used for like sort of those kinds of commercial purposes that benefit a single company, I don't think that's right. But I think if the data is used to make society better, that's good. Same goes for medical data, right? Same goes for data that National Geographic collects for ancestry information. So it really does depend upon how it is used and that it's freely available to people. So one company doesn't get a competitive edge over another.
So I'm going to keep challenging on this. I think, Sarah at the beginning talked a lot, Sarah Pedroza has talked about the sort of rising importance of social sustainability, so things beyond just the environmental things, and this seems to be the key issue. There's other issues of bias and so on, but in these future scenarios that we're envisioning, if we want to model them, we could look back at how we use cell phones. And initially, phones with cameras weren't permitted in certain places. There was a lot of worry about the tracking devices that they could be. Before that, we talked about cookies on websites, and these are things that come up every 5 or 10 years, and we seem to kind of follow exactly the same path of just clicking our way into, using them more and more. So what do you think that we've reached some kind of a turning point? I mean, are we actually going to do this differently than we've done all the other stuff, or is this just a nice philosophical conversation, but it's going to be Google Inc. everywhere? Are you giving up hope?
Oh, well, I think
By
that...
the way, audience, ask questions if you
Now
want
we're going to
build
start to
on.
get into like a philosophical thing, but I don't like the idea of a few companies having control over everything, right? That goes back to the 1970s movie Rollerball, right? That's really frightening. So that's why I think free access to the data is important. And I think the startup community, for example, and a large space of that is going to be focused on application development, could use that data to create other things, right? So there's other people who can come into the space using that data to create new services, whatever they might be, like Uber, right, was a first, then there's Lyft, Airbnb. The shared economy actually came about as a result of that data, which actually created all kinds of new jobs and services for people. So it's not inherently a bad thing. It's just whether or not it's misused. But no, I don't like the model where it's Google everything or Amazon everything, because then it puts everybody else out of business because they can't compete. But there has to be a regulatory component to it as well, right, where the government has to get involved, right? Otherwise, you get to places where there's monopolies that get set up. So the government does have to keep involved in making sure that that doesn't happen. So I don't know what the laws are like in Europe, but certainly in the US, like there's anti-monopoly laws.
Of course, we have to find the right balance between the regulation and the use of data so that something is possible. If I come back to what you said, of course, if we are thinking that if we cannot collect data anymore, we cannot do anything. And with data, we can improve a lot of services that are really important. So, of course, regulation is central. But if we are thinking, for example, in the perspective of the geography, we can see that we can collect a lot of data, for example, in the city centers, because you have a lot of users. So you can have a much better services than, for example, in the suburbia, where you have not so many people. So it's much more difficult to have the anonymity of the data, because you know that the anonymity is really difficult to have. Maybe if you have 1 million of people, it's much more easier than if you have just 10,000 or just 500. So it's also the question of the equity. And where you can have the better services, if you can have the better services just in the city center where you have a high density of data, or if you can have better services maybe with less data also in suburban. So it's really a huge question of equity, I think, for the future.
So there was I believe a Danish writer who said, there was an article a few years ago, in the future, you'll have no privacy, you'll own nothing, and you'll be happier than you've ever been before. And the idea is that basically these services would kind of take away the day-to-day, troubles that we have with, maintaining things that we own and sort of having a car parked somewhere that is just blocking up the street or whatever else, and that actually we wouldn't miss privacy all that much. What do you think?
I don't know that I would couple convenience of mass transit to absence of privacy. I don't couple those two things in my mind. So I think there's ways that you can collect information on people's movements, timings of it, and not couple to it their purchasing habits, for example. I think it's the purchasing habits that's what people are worried about, because then they start to tap into your private life. So movement data can be collected and used advantageously, I think, in terms of making your life more convenient and being greener in the way that you travel. So I think that's where you have to make sure you have the right regulations to prevent that personal stuff, like the type of people that I like or the type of food that I want to eat. That should be taken out, because then you're starting to go into that privacy space. But that would be my way around it.
So actually, those are exactly the types of things you can extrapolate from location data. So, the list of things you can look at, from political to purchasing and sexual and all kinds of associations based on where you get picked up and dropped off, at what times of day, and things like that. That's actually data that Fitbit and Uber and everybody already knows about us.
But if person A doesn't have a name, therefore they can't send the advertisement back to me.
But with 3 pieces, well, it's not about advertising. If 3 pieces of location data, like your zip code and birth date, you can basically narrow down, in the United States, you could narrow that down to like one individual. It's that easy, because there just aren't that many data points. There aren't that many people living in a zone and have the same birthday and things like that. So there's a lot that I think we're just starting to tackle. So this is just mobility and privacy. There's lots of other social issues like inclusion. So I live in San Francisco, and they've already started tearing up the parking spaces in front of certain streets and putting in parks, and looking at basically how people who have mobility, that is personal mobility issues, that are elderly, for example, will be able to better use autonomous vehicles as a service than they are able to use the public transit. So is that too early to start talking about, what autonomous vehicles are going to do for inclusion and mobility?
Maybe we have to think about the challenge of mobility is it's also not just about privacy and not just about data. It's more how the big challenge of the mobility today is to understand how to move a lot of people on the right time, and so it's more the question of the mass public or not public transit. And so I think it could be also a possibility to have another debate to think what is the challenge we want to tackle. Mm-hmm. If we want really to tackle the question of new services, or if you want to tackle also the question of how we can optimize what we already have. Because I said at the beginning that the question of the mobility is a question of the tension between an infrastructure, vehicles, social activity, and the localization. But we have an infrastructure. And if we come back, for example, because you are speaking about the air, but we have already an infrastructure that is existing. And we have a problem of financing this infrastructure. How we can finance, for example, better roads, how we can finance the maintenance of the road, how we can finance, for example, the subway in New York. Mm-hmm. And these are all really big challenges. And I think here we have to think about how we can use, for example, startups or new technology or innovation to find a way to find a solution for this problem, mm-hmm. and not just focus about new services, about Uber, about Google, because they are, of course, they can be of great help. Mm-hmm. Autonomous vehicle can be also of great help, but mm-hmm. we exactly know that with autonomous vehicle, it could be the best or the worst. Mm-hmm. It's I'm totally agree with you that the real question is also the shared mobility, because if you have a thermical autonomous vehicle, it will be a nightmare. It won't be a dream. You just have another problem. So I think if we are thinking about mobility, we have really to think in a multi-dimensional way. Mm-hmm. And also we have to think about how we can tackle very big problems that mm-hmm. maybe are not sexy, mm-hmm. I know, but here there is a huge potential of innovation. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I guess from the autonomy perspective, I'm an engineer and I'm a pilot. So I view autonomy as a way of getting a much more complex mission done in a much more efficient manner and a safer manner. So right now, if you fly in an aircraft commercially, going from city A to city B mm-hmm. at a major commercial provider, mm-hmm. once you get to a certain altitude, you are actually required by the FAA or the European equivalent to turn on your autopilot. And the reason for that is your autopilot does a much better job of maintaining your speed, your altitude, and your position than you can as a human being. Mm-hmm. So autonomy actually adds a level of safety to transport that you can't get with having human beings in the loop. So autonomy already exists from the aviation side of mm-hmm. things. Adding it to cars has the potential to add more safety. Adding it to trains has the potential to add more safety. There were 2 failures in the United States rail system over the past 2 to 3 years. Both of them were due to human operator error. Mm-hmm. So I view that as a technology solution to increase safety mm-hmm. and have a higher density of traffic and more packed vehicles, which then can reduce your carbon footprint as a result. But in general, from the engineering side, you're always trying to do things to make your vehicle more efficient, which then reduces your carbon footprint, and to make your vehicle lower cost, which facilitates transit to everybody. It's true that there are social implications, but we can't be the only players in this space, right? Government planners have to be involved. Other companies who are providing more apps-based services like Uber have to be involved because we're doing it actually to create a better system for people. So everybody else needs to have that as their motivation as well. And everyone should be cognizant of it.
Yeah. Okay, so I see there's some questions coming in from the audience. You can also vote on those questions. So I'm going to give it just like one more round while you submit some more questions, upvote, downvote the ones that are there, and then we'll dive into those. And so to then wrap up our direct conversation, I started out by talking about the number of different modes that are emerging, and we've also, in this conversation, talked about the number of different problems we're trying to tackle, from emissions to social inclusion to just nicer, more livable cities. So this is a lot of goals, a lot of big goals, and a lot of big solutions. Like, how do we model this? How do we actually do the work of bringing this, to benefit humans?
There is a solution, for example, with the mass. Mm-hmm. This is a solution. It's not always working with the mass, but it is really promising, I think, because with mass, so mobility as a service, we can think how to combine different modes, and I think. Of course, the future is not to have just for one kind of mobility, one kind of transport, but how we can combine during the day different modes of transport in a way that it's not disturbing and it's very easy for the users. And so the question is, who will be organizing the mass? Mm-hmm. Is this a private company? Is this a city? And you have... Also, another problem with the mass is the scale, mm-hmm. because if we are thinking about, but it's a problem, but also a solution with the mass, because with the mass you can combine some private offers and with public transport offers. So maybe it could be the solution to solve the question of the scale that. Because for example, for public transportation, it's very difficult because if you are out the perimeters of the city and of the authority of the city, mm-hmm. There is nobody to decide. Mm-hmm. So that's why also a lot of people are taking the cars. Mm-hmm. So maybe with the mass, you can combine these different scales, these different mm-hmm. actors, and it could be a solution. I see this kind of way, and of course. On the scale of the city, that you have a real good department of transportation that can organize it on the scale of the city.
Okay.
And I think the easiest way to think about transportation is it's kind of your responsibility to improve the quality of people's lives. And the one way you do that is making the transportation easy to use and affordable. And the way you get to the masses is by making it affordable. So that's where engineering and technology can come in, right? Because you can then disrupt the way a certain type of vehicle is made. You can introduce an entirely new form of transportation like the Hyperloop, have a really low energy consumption, which then translates on a lower ticket cost to the passenger, and then everybody has the ability to use this nice, fast mode of transportation. In LA, I can give you an example, terrible mass transportation, mainly buses, and sadly, lower income people are forced to sit on buses for hours to be able to get from point A to point B, and that's not fair, and that's not doing something which is good for the masses. So if you have a new form of transportation, which inherently has a low cost because it's engineered in that way, has a low energy footprint, which then translates to a lower ticket cost per person, all of a sudden you have something which is affordable, it's more time effective, and you're improving the quality of everybody's lives. And then for me and my company, actually, I love flying. I'm a pilot. I think there's nothing more exciting than being able to have this bird's eye view of being just 1,000 to 2,000 feet in the air. The idea to let other people experience that too as part of their commute, it's actually a lot of fun, is nice. And I think it would improve the quality of people's lives if you do it efficiently.
Of course, this is a big challenge, how we can improve the quality of life. And for example, I can give you a French example. In the city of Lyon, we can show that the city of Lyon was working on public space, on city planning view, and also on the offers of city bikes. And we can show that, we can see that in very few years, because the quality of the service of the public transport was so high, that we can see the shift from the cars user to public transport and to free bikes system. So it's a really an important thing, because if we are thinking why are the people using the car, also if they have an alternative. A lot of people do not have an alternative yet. But if you have an alternative, the people are using cars because it's more convenient, it's more comfortable. It's not just a vehicle, it's your house, it's your home. You can store things, you can have the picture of your children, of your lovers, you can have a lot of things, and you can do a lot of things in the car also. And so this is it improves the quality of life. And if you are thinking about public transport, you are not directly think about it's improving my quality of life, because you are thinking about dirt, about a lot of people, about congestions to be just like that, and it's too late, and you do not have the flexibility. And so if you are really working on the question of the quality of services of the public transport, you can make a step away to the individual car. And that's what I meant with we really need innovation, and we need investment in innovation in public transport, and not just in funny, sexy cars. Because if you are just investing in funny, sexy cars or new services on not shared mobility, of course the people will choose that. We are all human and we just have to have a nice life, and not just to every day try to just to have a heavy life.
Yeah, just get on with things. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's turn to the audience questions. So as far as I can read, the top voted question here is from Dylan, and it is, so many stakeholders, startups, regulators, governments, state actors, and citizens, who should be taking the lead on defining future mobility, or future mobile city, excuse me. Who's taking the lead? We are, of course, but Hello Tomorrow is.
We should have public forums where these things are discussed, right?
Yeah.
So I don't think it should be, because if you're just a government person, you may not have the right background because you're coming and getting elected for a whole variety of reasons. So there should be forums which engage stakeholders, which engage on the government side, as well as technology startups, as well as regular corporate entities who have these decisions on what's the way to move forward. This is going to sound cheesy, but like, for example, in the space program where I spent most of my career, there's actually forums of scientists who represent different interests, like the Mars community, the Venus community, and they get together every year to talk about what is the way to move forward in this type of exploration. Why shouldn't that be done in the way a city is planned, right? Where you have experts from a variety of different disciplines come in and think about that, and then you'll get a better solution as a result.
Yeah, I think nobody will take the lead. We have to find a compromise between all the people, because all the people are important. For example, in France, you cannot think about mobility innovation without the state and without the city, because, for example, for autonomous vehicle, it is a law state that it's not allowed to have an autonomous vehicle without the people, because a vehicle is in the right, a vehicle with somebody, with somebody that is driving the car. So we have to work with all the people and to find a compromise.
Yeah, okay.
I actually think it's an important point, though, because you could use Uber as an example of how Uber came in, right, and all of a sudden everyone scrambled, like, well, what about regulating this, right? And it ended up getting shut down in a bunch of different cities because the government wasn't set up to be able to do it. So if the government isn't a equal partner in establishing these solutions, you're going to have things like that where the technology comes first and it gets halted because people start to work on the regulation after the fact.
Right. Well, so this is an interesting pattern, and I'll say it's a pattern because, like I've said earlier, kind of everything works that way. It seems like, the startups propose something, see how it works in this, like, it's a unregulated or sort of like pre-legal space, right? And then people sort of city by city around the world start to look at each other almost as experiments and then work that out. So is it more of a question of like whoever takes the lead gets to choose?
I mean, I can tell you what we're doing at my company, which is that we don't have the bandwidth and the funding to take care of every single problem. Like, we can't build the infrastructure, we can't build the updates to the air traffic control. We're building the vehicle, we're building the software to control the vehicle, right? So it's an ecosystem, and I am taking initiative by attending conferences, for example, meeting with government regulators to make sure that, this is what we need, this is what's in the pipeline. There are nonprofit organizations that exist like SAE, Society of Automotive Aerospace Engineers, that come in and say, FAA, let's get together and figure out what do we need to update. There's a Uber Elevate Summit every year where that happens. So it has to be a community activity where you're working with the government, with the technology providers, and actively saying, this is what I need, push back both directions. And that's the way to do it. And it has to happen now. Otherwise, you'll have problems where you can't move forward.
Yeah.
It's difficult to say who is first, because some startups are coming, and because they are trying something, maybe it's not working, but the city can move on and can be also more ambitious. But you can have another way where the city is building, because they have the responsibility of a lot of things in the, not just mobility, but also health and social inclusion and employment and urban planning, so they can also force a kind of mobility, a kind of offer. If you, for example, reduce the size of the street for the cars, of course you let also more place for another startups that just startups that are working on cars. So I think it's a play between startups and cities, and you will always have some cities that are more innovative in the proposition. And I think it's a very important thing what you said about the exchange of experiences, and to have this place where we can share. But of course you will not find the solutions that you can just take and make in your city. So you have to adapt, but you can be, inspired.
Okay, good.
But I would say, just because it's important to the audience here, that as a technology provider, if you are a startup, you do have a social responsibility to think about how you're going to be playing with the regulatory framework, and you then do have a responsibility to communicate that in some way. You can't be like, a massive entity, and I'll use the example of like a SpaceX or something or like a Tesla. You can't railroad over things. You have to work with governments to make sure that you'll be able to put it in, because otherwise neither of you are going to be successful. So you do have a responsibility as the technology provider to be engaged very early on in making sure that the government understands what you're doing and how it might affect it.
Right. I mean, these are just interesting examples. So Tesla, SpaceX happen to be, technology startups, and one guy behind the two of them. But also, autonomous driving, that was Google that basically said there was no law that said we couldn't do that. And, Uber, same thing. So it seems like not breaking the law, but going into a space where the law doesn't really cover what we're doing, and then just figuring it out. Because a lot of the people here at this event, especially in the startup space, they are facing exactly that type of regulatory uncertainty. And do you think that they should engage with cities first and then figure it out? Or would their startup survive if they do that? There's this movie, a US movie called Zootopia, where the Department of Motor Vehicles is manned by sloths. So you saw I had a sloth in your picture earlier, and they take forever to press one button. So as a startup, are you just committing suicide by engaging with cities?
That has not been my experience, though.
Yeah.
So when I was working for a Hyperloop technology company, we actively started to think about what we need to do from a regulatory perspective, and governments actually work with us. So I think that is historically that's like a stereotype against government entities, but I don't think it's historically been that way. And even on the FAA side, people are always coming up with new aircraft, and you always have to go through a certification. It's really prescriptive as to what you need to do, and they will work with you and give you exceptions to meet what you need to do. NASA, same thing, right? They'll work with you. So I think there's a fear that that's the case, that it can be overwhelming and you're drowning in paperwork, but it's more a fear because you're new at this, you haven't done this before, and maybe you just need some help. So bring in some consultants, bring in some agencies that actually do this for a living, right? How you do certification, and that's how you can inform yourself as to what you need to do. But my experience, both on the Hyperloop side and now on the aircraft side, is actually not that bad.
Okay. Chloe, anything to add? No. Okay, so we have one more audience question. Do you believe there's will for governments to implement these solutions and infrastructure? Existing technologies exist, existing technologies do exist by definition, but political actors appear unwilling. So I guess that's more of a statement than a question. Do you believe there's will? So do governments want to do this? Like, what's the political benefit to sticking your neck out and throwing, out a technology that people may or may not be ready for? I mean, what's the political calculus there? We had the Jean-Philippe Macron earlier. Like, what's the appeal to the younger voters, or what do you do? It's hard.
With this question, it's difficult because what kind of technology? What are we speaking about? It's with new mobility services, we can speak about different things, and so the willingness of the political side will be different. And of course, this is a question of the costs because if you are working on the infrastructure, this is a big challenges because at this time, for example, for who finances the infrastructure? Who is financing is the city, so of course, or maybe with taxes. And we have seen that, for example, in France with the crisis of the Gilets jaunes. It's not so easy to find money to finance, for example, the climate and the energy transition, to finance also the questions. We see the debate about the urban No. I do not have the name in English.
What's it in French?
Péage urbain. Péage urbain.
Don't know.
So you have to pay to come in the city.
City tolls, basically, right?
City toll. And the question is that at the end, the citizen is paying, and of course, at the end, the citizen is electing the political people. So it's a very difficult question, and that's why I think it's important what you say. We really have to have a win-win situation. Two things are important: to work together, to understand the vision of the city. So that's true. And one is also on the side of the technology and of the startup side to think about the social responsibility. It's an important thing. Mobility is not just to transport people. It's really, and it do have an impact in several sides of the city and several fields in the city. For example, in health, in social inclusion, in employment, and the city have to take into account those different sides that the startup do not have to take into account. So I think if we are thinking in a more multidimensional way, we can more understand why the politicians sometimes are not so willing to move, but it's also it's up to the startups to inspire the politicians and to convince them.
Good. All right.
I'm an optimist, I'll say, by definition. But I actually think that by creating a new infrastructure project and improving people's quality of life and reducing their commute, you can actually use that as a sales pitch behind why your campaign for office is better than somebody else's. So infrastructure projects, it's true they could go horribly wrong and you could destroy your political career because they go over budget, but they could also go really well and improve the quality of life for people and turn a city around, and you can become, president of a country. So I think with there's always great risk, but then there's also great reward, and you have to be a courageous leader, and those are the types of people that I hope get voted into office.
Yeah. All right, well, we're out of time, certainly not out of questions and thoughts and ideas. So thank you very much, and thank you, audience, for your question. Let's all thank each other for this interaction. And please join us and find us later on if you want to keep talking about mobility.